Welcome back. When we left, Antiochus' decrees outlawing all Jewish practices and requiring adoption of Greek religion and custom had brought the Jewish faith to the brink of extinction. Now the page turns, and Judaism finally strikes back. It begins at a little town in the Judean countryside called Modin. There lived an aged priest called Mattathias, who had 5 sons. History would soon call them the Maccabees. To Modin came in 166 BC a Seleucid officer named Apelles. It was his mission to visit villages in turn and require them to initiate the cult of Zeus. He had an altar to this god set up in Modin and called upon Mattathias, the senior priest there, to perform the sacrifice. This was his response. But Mattathias answered in a loud voice, "Although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that they forsake the religion of their ancestors and consent to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kindred will keep to the covenant of our ancestors. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law and the commandments." The officer was willing to accept a substitute, and another villager stepped forward. Mattathias drew a weapon and killed the collaborator on the spot. Then he struck down the Seleucid officer as well. This was the beginning. Then Mattathias cried out in the city, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and who stands by the covenant follow me." He and his 5 sons withdrew into the hills to begin a resistance movement. Like David of old, they and their growing supporters evaded the Seleucid forces, striking when they could, but the enemy knew the Jews had a weakness, the Sabbath. And it was on that day, when a large body of rebels were located by the troops in a cave. They said, "Let us all die in innocence. Heaven and earth are our witnesses that you destroy us unjustly." So the officers and soldiers attacked them on the Sabbath, and they died with their wives, their children, and their animals, to the number of 1,000 persons. It was a disaster for the movement, and it forced them to re-examine their sacred tradition. They said to one another, "If we all do as our kindred have done, and do not fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our laws, they will soon destroy us from the earth." So on that day they came to this decision: "Let us fight against anyone who attacks us on the Sabbath, so that we may not all die as our kindred died in their secret refuges." Mattathias and his sons were priests, having no military training whatsoever, but they learned fast. One son, Judas, was named to lead the rebels, and for 5 years he did so with astonishing success. He earned the name Maccabees, the Hammer of God. At first this was a guerrilla campaign. They would ambush a Seleucid patrol, but they also moved about the countryside, destroying idols, urging parents to circumcise their sons, and reopening abandoned synagogues. This was, after all, not just a political rebellion, it was faith-driven. They became known for punishing Hellenistic Jews and for championing a return to the Mosaic covenant. The Hasidim, the pious, took up arms with them. Together they did what damage they could to the king's forces. But soon it became genuine warfare. Apollonius, governor of Samaria, fielded his troops in search of Judas, but Judas found and ambushed him. He actually killed Apollonius in personal combat and took his sword, continuing to use it in future battles. This victory had a great psychological benefit to the rebellion, showing that Judas was not just a guerrilla fighter, but was capable of defeating a major enemy force. He also looted Apollonius' camp for supplies and weapons, and word of the victory brought him many recruits. Next came the Syrian commander Seron. He too was hunting Judas, leading a force of about 3,000. Judas, with perhaps 300 men, ambushed Seron in the hill country at Beth Horon. Seron lost some 800 men and saw his force scattered. The battle proved two things. The Macedonian phalanx, so formidable on wide plains, could do little in hilly country, and Judas was seen to have the tactical skill to use the terrain against an enemy. That skill would continue to grow. Judas' next major battle came at Emmaus, where his tactical brilliance was on full display. The two Seleucid commanders, Nicator and Georgius, are said by the early sources to have fielded an army of 46,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Modern historians, however, judge those figures to be inflated. Their estimate is a bit less than half that. Judas was encamped in the hills around Mizpah, and Nicanor learned this. He sent Georgius with about 2,000 elite troops to strike Judas at night, but Judas was actually luring the Seleucids to do just this. He made a night march and struck Nicanor's major force in encampment just at dawn. Any who were awake would have had the sun in their eyes as Judas' men bore down on them from the hills. They routed the Seleucids, pursuing them west across the plain. Then they looted the camp and lay in wait for George's force. Having found no one at Mizpah, these returned exhausted and disgusted. They were an easy prey for the waiting Jews. Once again, Judas acquired supplies and weapons from the enemy, and once again he proved his own tactical genius. Mobility and knowledge of the terrain were his allies. And there was more here. Judas' two major victories had taken place in the valley of Ajalon. Every Jew would perceive the symbolism in this. It was the scene of one of Joshua's most dramatic victories, where, in pursuing the enemy, he called, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon." And the sun stood still and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. Once again, God was fighting for his people. But the challenges continued, as Antiochus grew more and more frustrated with his commander's failure to crush these Jews. He sent his own regent, Lysias, this time, with the largest force yet. We should note how Antiochus was pressing harder and harder on the Jewish resistance. Apollonius fielded a moderate force. Seron, what contemporaries called a multitude. Nicanor and Georgius were sent by the empire's regent with some 22,000, and when these failed, Lysias himself brought an even more massive army, including 20 elephants. In all these engagements, Judas was outnumbered at least 4-1, and still defeated them. For Lysias, Judas chose a defensive posture at Beth Zur. Holding the high ground, he fought Lysias' massive force to a standstill. His brother Eleazar, who had fought at Judas' side from the beginning, charged at one of the enemy's elephants, believing mistakenly that Antiochus himself was riding it. He stabbed the beast from beneath, and it collapsed and crushed him. And then, in a quirk of fate, Lysias learned that Antiochus, campaigning far away, had indeed been killed. Realizing the succession to the kingdom was in question, he was forced to withdraw from the battle. This left the road to Jerusalem open for Judas and for cleansing of the temple at last. Judas could now claim Jerusalem. The Acra was still garrisoned, but its men stayed behind its walls. Judas' weary fighters entered the courts of the temple, only to find them desolate. Scrub and bushes had overgrown them, and trash was everywhere. David Carter describes the scene. At this sight, the discipline of the soldiers broke. The hardened fighters who had faced down cavalry charges and phalanxes of trained infantry now rent their clothes in a traditional sign of mourning. They fell to the ground, throwing dust on their heads and weeping openly. The altar of sacrifice was still fouled by the altar of Zeus. First Maccabees records their uncertainty as how to cleanse it. They deliberated what ought to be done with the altar for burnt offerings that had been desecrated. They decided it best to tear it down, lest it be a lasting shame that the Gentiles had defiled it, so they tore down the altar. They stored the stones in a suitable place on the Temple Mount until the coming of a prophet who could determine what to do with them. A new altar was built according to the instructions in the Torah. The furnishings, long gone, would have to be crafted again, but at least they had the Torah to tell them just how they were to look. Then there was the sacred oil for supplying the menorah's lamps, and here tradition tells us a miracle occurred. They found only one cruse of oil, enough for 1 day, but a miracle occurred and they lit from it for 8 days. A beautiful tale, but none of the contemporary sources mention it. It first appears in a Babylonian Talmud scroll dating to the 6th century A.D. Even so, the temple was rededicated, and the event became a perpetual celebration, an 8-day festival of lights called Hanukkah. For 3 years the temple had been contaminated. Daniel's prophecy tells us about that period. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled under foot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." That prophecy was fulfilled to the day, as First Maccabees records. On the anniversary of the day on which the Gentiles had desecrated it, on that very day it was rededicated with songs, harps, lyres, and cymbals. And now we return to the rebellion, not over by any means. At this point, the Hasidim, who had fought alongside Judas from the first, now deserted him. Their commitment had always been to restore the temple and its rituals, and that was now accomplished. They even had a high priest from the line of Zadok, supported by the new king, Demetrius I. The Hasidim had no goal of reestablishing political independence, and so they left the cause. And General Nicanor returned, taking position close to Jerusalem with a force that, like the others, still outnumbered Jason's band. It was a new king who had sent him, with orders to take Judas alive. Some parleying took place, which ended with Nicanor threatening to destroy the temple. Though outnumbered some 2-1, Judas chose to meet the Seleucids head-on, and he prevailed again, even killing Nicanor. He took the general's head and right hand as trophies, the hand, he said, that he had raised against God's temple, and carried them in triumph. The people proclaimed a Nicanor Day to be celebrated annually. This, however, was to be Judas' last great victory, but not his last battle. That would come against Maccabees, the best general the king could field, and he would face a fractured coalition. After 4 years of campaigning, the local farmers and shepherds, who had been a major part of his army, were weary and concerned about the neglect of their normal lives, and the myth of Judas' invincibility was fading. Maccabees reached Elasa, almost at the gates of Jerusalem, and Judas had to face him. The general had 22,000, with 2,000 of them cavalry. Judas had only 3,000 men, and on seeing Maccabees' army, fear won over. Just 800 heeded Judas' challenge to face them. With Maccabees in the forefront, Judas opted for a decapitation strike to scatter the force by killing the commander. Their charge broke the enemy's front line, but cavalry then surrounded and wiped them out. Judas, the accounts say, died fighting bravely. With the hammer gone, the cause fell to his brother, Jonathan. A fighter, yes, but more. They called him the Cunning, and he would need that skill. The Syrians and the Hellenists now owned Jerusalem again, and Jonathan fled with his band back to guerrilla warfare for the next 7 years. But playing the long game, he studied the instability of the enemy. David Carter explains, he understood something fundamental about the new reality. The Seleucid Empire was devouring itself. A bewildering succession of claimants, usurpers, and counterclaimants vied for the throne in Antioch. Jonathan, from his wilderness stronghold, watched and waited, offering his military support to whichever side offered the better deal. He transformed the Jewish cause from a local insurgency to a key pawn in a geopolitical chess match. When Alexander Ballas challenged Demetrius, both of them asked Jonathan for support. Ballas got it and offered him the high priesthood in return. As it happened, the stars were aligned for just this development. The Zadokite high priest Alcimus had died with no legitimate successor, and temple ritual was falling apart. The Hellenizers were bullying the pious, and the people wanted stability and religious legitimacy. A priest himself, with the king's support, Jonathan could offer that, and so a Maccabee came down from the hills and into the city and the temple. Now, Israel was still under foreign rule, But the Seleucid kingdom was in disarray. For the next 10 years, Jonathan used that to play various actors against one another, obtaining concessions for the Jews. Internally, he gave Israel a wise and even-handed administration. Externally, he increased its territory, sometimes militarily, sometimes diplomatically. But then his diplomatic luck ran out. Visiting Antioch for negotiations, he was seized and murdered. The last remaining brother, Simon, now offered himself as replacement. 1 Maccabees records his speech. "You know yourself what great things I and my brethren and my father's house have done for the laws and the sanctuary. It is battles and it is troubles which we have seen. All my brethren have been slain for Israel's sake, and I am left alone. Now therefore, be it far from me that I should spare my life in the time of trouble, for I am no better than my brethren. Doubtless I will avenge my nation and the sanctuary and our wives and children, for all the heathen are gathered to destroy us of very malice." He was accepted by acclamation, and one of his first achievements was what none before him could do. He united all three factions. In 142 BC, he also obtained a limited form of independence from the Syrian king, who remitted their taxes and granted them the status of an ally. But true independence came when Rome offered its blessing with a foedus amicitiae, a treaty recognizing their independence, promising mutual defense, and naming Simon as high priest, ethnarch, and leader of Israel. One may think of 1948, when Israel proclaimed itself an independent nation, and then held its breath until the United States gave them official recognition. Suddenly, the world saw a new nation, and that is what Rome's treaty did for them in 142 BC. Simon proved as good as his promise. He was wise, fair, and considerate of all. Paul Botha says of this time, "With independence secured, the Hasmoneans began to build a kingdom. They expanded borders, fortified cities, strengthened the economy, and re-established Jewish law." After so much unrest at home and threat from abroad, the people at last had what they desired. 1 Maccabees records what the people put into the record. "Simon shall be their leader and high priest forever, until a trustworthy prophet arises. He shall act as governor over them, and shall have charge of the sanctuary, to make regulations concerning its functions and concerning the country, its weapons and strongholds. He shall be obeyed by all. All contracts in the country shall be written in his name, and he shall be clothed in purple and gold." But this sounds like they declare him both high priest and king. That's a combination Israel has never had. And he will be that until a trustworthy prophet arises. One wonders what such a prophet might say. Well, more to come, with Simon as first of a Hasmonean dynasty. Please join us when we explore their record. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in this series, you may address them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Four, at yahoo.com.